years, actually.
Okay.
So I've watched a lot of your videos because I'm the kind of person that, late at night when I'm finished reading, I like watching documentaries on philosophers that I can find.
Yeah.
Um,
I-
and I found a lot of your videos. So a lot of your videos on German idealism were really interesting, and I thought they were, cutting edge that was on YouTube. And I'm not just saying this to blow your ego up or anything like that. I mean, honestly. So, like, even with our project right now with plastic pills, it's modeled on some of the kind of ideas that you have put out, but we wanted to give it a more I wanted to give it two interphases. We wanted to give it one where it's a bunch of friends in a room talking about ideas, and then really hardcore deep dives. So you're kind of a pioneer in that sense. So there you go.
Yeah, well, that's interesting the way you guys are trying to frame philosophy in the context of friendships, because that's exactly the context out of which German idealism emerged.
Mm-hmm.
With the Romantic Circle in Jena and all of these figures being in tumultuous friendships, and Schelling and Hegel, I guess, having the most famous friendship and break. But then I think it was it might have been Jason Worth that wrote an essay. I hope I'm not getting that wrong. It might have been Jason who wrote an essay about a letter from Hegel to his wife that talks about running into Schelling in like the late 1820s at a bathhouse. And it's just totally unexpectedly. And Hegel said something like, "We got along just like friends of old, like nothing had ever happened."
Yeah,
To,
I, I know. Hegel sent Schelling a letter around 18. Is it 1810? I could be wrong. And he was worried about Holderlin. Actually, Holderlin's kind of descent into madness.
I think it was earlier than 1810. I think the
Oh,
last letter that Hegel and Schelling exchanged was with the Phenomenology, when Hegel sent him a copy of the Phenomenology
uh,
of Spirit. But he may
yes,
have worried about Holderlin earlier than that.
yes. Holderlin's a
Yeah.
fantastic thinker.
Oh, well, you need to be a little mad to be a good poet and a good philosopher if we're going to take Schelling at his word. In the Freedom essay, he says that, I think.
It's true. I have a Schelling shirt actually. I don't collect philosophy shirts, but it says, I am. It shows a big bottle of wine, and it says, "You would drink too if you were Schelling." Um,
Does it have that photograph of him as Count Dracula, or is it?
you mean my homage to him that's on my desk?
Yes, that's the photo.
Count Dracula. I like that. I like that.
He had a hard life.
Yeah. Yes, you're right. The circle was fantastic. Goethe, the Schlegels, Novalis, Holderlin, Hegel, Schelling. I
Fichte.
think their room, yeah, Fichte. I think their room was actually called the Augustin room. Like they named their kind of dorm room the Augustin room, actually.
Wow. Yeah, I've heard that. I just read this letter. I think it was one of Goethe's letters. He was talking about a story that Schiller told him about, where for a couple weeks, couple months, maybe even, Schiller and Schelling were playing some German board game, the equivalent of checkers, and they just weren't like they couldn't really establish a rapport, and like Schiller really wanted to talk to Schelling about philosophy, but they couldn't. They were just awkward in playing this game, and Schiller was like, "Why are we wasting?" Thinking to himself, wasting our time on this, and um, so it didn't always work.
Right.
And but I think that the dialectic that Hegel would become famous for, and I think there's a lot of a return to German idealism now that's recovering the ways in which you can't understand Hegel without all the other people on his team, all of his friends, that, there's not
Right.
that much original in the Phenomenology of Spirit, really. Brilliant execution under duress as Napoleon's invading and all that. But, Schelling and Fichte had lifted a lot of that, a lot of those ideas into prominence before Hegel wrote the Phenomenology. But my point here is that the dialogue between these friends is what generated our understanding of the dialectic of history and the dialectic of nature, or just the dialectic of being and becoming. I mean, all of that emerged in the context of intense friendships, which makes sense because philosophy is about friendship with wisdom. And
Right.
there's a way in which I think the German idealist accomplishment and achievement is it forces us to let go of this idea. It's so tempting, this idea of individual genius. It's so tempting, especially with someone like Goethe. But who would Goethe be without the people he was in dialogue with?
Mm-hmm.
You know, and so I think it helps us understand genius as a mode of a form of community. Actually, it requires a community of inquirers to generate new breakthroughs in consciousness. Really, the evolution of consciousness.
I think that's what they were trying to aim for. Like a system, even in the vocation of Fichte's vocation of a scholar, you find, like, for him, community and the scholar itself is a gradual coming together, a becoming of you know, I don't want to say intellectual intuition, but it's a kind of coming together of intelligence of everyone kind of growing with this kind of unfolding of knowledge.
And it was these same thinkers and communities of thinkers in Germany that invented the modern university, you know.
Right.
I mean, universities have been around for a while, but the idea of a research community that's inquiring into the nature of the universe, free of any theological framework or dogmatic set of interpretations, just able to inquire freely in dialogue with one another. That idea is also being forged, just as these German idealists are beginning to articulate their thoughts.
Schelling's really big on this. He's really big on the idea of the freedom of intellectual pursuit. And so when he takes his Berlin post and he's speaking with, I think it's Maximilian II, I could be wrong. He says, you know, am I allowed to teach how I want to teach? Because he'd been in Bavaria, Catholic Bavaria, right? And kind of been chased out.
Yeah.
So this idea of intellectual freedom is very important to, I guess, all of them as well too. Even you know, in the Phenomenology of Spirit, where, you know, Hegel sees Napoleon as the world spirit unfolding and, you know, democratizing Europe, even though it was going to turn into an utter failure. But
yeah, such is the history of attempts at democracy.
Yes. So
Yeah.
How did you come into German idealism?
So the first time I studied it formally, like in school, I mean, I read Kant in college as an undergraduate, but not deeply. I majored in cognitive science, and so I was aware of the Kantian approach, but I didn't really go deeply into German idealism until graduate school. And I took a course with now my colleague, Sean Kelly, who has written a book on Jung and Hegel. And Sean Kelly is really, he's a Hegelian, and had us read excerpts from, I think, the introduction to the Phenomenology. And this would have been in like 2009 or something. So about 11 years ago, I was 23, 24 or something. And so I read Hegel's introduction. I ended up reading the Phenomenology and didn't understand most of it. And I was like, okay, I need to read the context, intellectual. I need to read the other people in his social circles who he was engaging with. And so it's like, okay, I'll read Fichte and Schelling. And Fichte was like mesmerizing, and I understood better what he was talking about than with Hegel. And then I got into Schelling, and his philosophy of nature was just, it was like he rang a bell and it just vibrated with the inner, like it made my heart sing, you know. I just felt this attraction to what Schelling was trying to articulate, that it made sense intellectually, but it resonated with me at a deeper level, aesthetically and morally even. And, you know, I've, since that point, first reading Schelling, have been struggling to articulate the differences between he and Hegel in a way that's fair to Hegel. Because the more that I find that, and Sean Kelly and I are in dialogue about this over the course of the last several years, it's very hard not to caricature Hegel when you're criticizing him. And I think Schelling is able to pull off a criticism of Hegel, negative philosophy, right? That I think is the best we can do, and that no one's really improved on that. So if we do want to break and again, here I might be caricaturing Hegel again, but sort of break the idealistic closure of the Hegelian system and open up again to a sense of metaphysical empiricism, as Schelling would put it, or as William James would later put it, radical empiricism, to return again to experience and say, hey, we can't ever come up with a system and finish it that could describe this creative advance, as Whitehead will end up calling it. And I think what Whitehead ends up articulating in the 21st century, in the 20th century, is a Schellingian, a post-Hegelian Schellingian philosophy of nature that certainly is dialectical, but not in the closed logical sense that Hegel imagined or seems to have imagined.
That's the Bradley influence for sure, right?
Yes, exactly. And others other British idealists that like Samuel Alexander.
Yeah, he's fantastic.
Yeah. So, that brings Whitehead into the picture here. But yeah, I started with Hegel and then worked my way backwards and realized I was a Schellingian.
That's really funny because I started my undergraduate as a Hegelian. I went to a small college and I read Kant with a retired Kantian, and fell in love with Hegel completely. But when I started taking more classes on continental philosophy in university, I felt it seemed like everything was too neat, too packaged perfectly with the phenomenology. And I didn't like this idea of mediation. I wanted something, mediation in regards to self-consciousness. When Hegel's talking about the differences between the unchangeable and the changeable, and then bringing it down to the level of like the priest, and he doesn't mean it. We didn't read it with a Christian lens. We just meant mediation in regards to the other. And I felt that there was something lacking, and I was on this long pursuit that took me to Nietzsche and then to Heidegger and then finally Deleuze. And now I'm a recovering Deleuzian. But then I took this class with my mentor, Joan Steigerwald, who's my dissertation advisor. And we read the Freedom Essay. And I had never, ever in my philosophical history read something as beautiful as this text. It blew me away. And I have a different reading of Schelling that I hope we're going to talk to, and we're going to move as this discussion goes. But the mythology that he brings up, I really, really like the mythological connotations to Schelling, because when he brings up things like the unvoordenklich, the unprethinkable, what is this unprethinkable? Like Ian Hamilton Grant will talk about it as, the predicate on one side of the beginning of the cosmos that we never get to. It's the 15 seconds after the Big Bang. But what is this? And so I like this I like this idea of the mythology filling in for this unprethinkable that also gives us content, philosophical content. Now, it's not like I'm going to read Genesis and think Adam and Eve is real, or read, Kronos eating his children and realize this is real. But this idea of forces and intensities that are contracting and expanding is something that he's looking at, right? I mean, as you said really, really nicely in your debate with, I think his name is it David Long? The German idealists, I mean, they are, you know, experimenting with the science of their time. They're experimenting with art. They're not fully like the French encyclopedists, but they are definitely, they have this kind of full philosophy. So when I read this, the Freiheitsschrift, the freedom essay, I that was it. Like I went to her and I said, I'm going to write my dissertation on Schelling.
Nice.
And that was it. And I became absolutely entrenched with him. Just, he just blew me away.
Yeah.
So we have similar stories.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So I wanted to go back to something you said earlier just about Hegel and the phenomenology of spirit. You said it was too tight and clean for you. I forget the exact adjectives you used to describe, but it struck me. I mean, for me, the phenomenology was like it was a richer sort of at least the attempt at a historical embedding of philosophy and logic, in the becoming of human societies and dynamics between people in a socio-historical context. And it's later the system of logic and the encyclopedia that for me became too, tight and everything has its place in this giant epicyclic system of circles within circles. And it's like, okay, that to me is why I call his system it's closed, as if everything's been wrapped up and he's achieved absolute knowledge. There's no more science to do. We can fill in the details in this circle over here maybe, but in the phenomenology of spirit, except for the last chapter, where he's like having his mountaintop vision, it's more open-ended and historical, and I think leaves room for further turns of the spiral. So that was that. So I think this is just my attempt to say Hegel's not. We need to study Hegel deeply, and I think I really think the phenomenology is obviously world historical importance, and we need to read it to understand how it has been deployed historically, but also new ways that it might be deployed in our own moment. And then with Schelling and his whole philosophy of mythology, which he was ahead of his time. I mean, lecturing about this stuff in the 1840s, while basically scientific positivism was just beginning
Right.
to really get launched. Everyone just was either didn't know what he was talking about or thought it was a regressive. And Schelling himself felt the need to apologize for choosing myth as an object for philosophical inquiry, in the beginning of his Berlin lectures, but he explains why it's necessary. And so the question becomes, myth is real, but how so? It's not real in the literal sense that 6,000 years ago, over the course of 6 days, Yahweh created the world and put Adam and Eve in the garden, and then they fucked it all up. But that mythic, that narrative is a memory of a real event in the history of consciousness. And yes, we remember it now today in this symbolic form, but it is real in the sense that it is where at least a large portion of the human beings currently alive on the planet have come in terms of the development of their consciousness. And for Schelling, right, this is all in the context of his philosophy of nature and of his understanding of the mind, where the human consciousness is a microcosm, very ancient doctrine, but Schelling sets that doctrine in a time developmental context, where the history of human consciousness as a process of mythological unfolding is a recapitulation or microcosm of nature's own evolution.
Yep.
And so to understand how nature came to be, we can learn by analogy from, and it's not allegorical, it's, as Schelling would say, tautogorical, understanding the history of human consciousness can actually reveal to us the same underlying principles at work and potencies at work that built nature. And so that idea leads to, I think Carl Jung takes up a similar kind of perspective, though he's a little bit, I think Jung was a little bit more confused about it than Schelling was. And it's interesting, he doesn't cite Schelling very much, as much as it's obvious there's a lineage there.
Mm-hmm.
Whitehead doesn't cite Schelling very much either. He does once, but it's also clear there's a lineage there too. But Schelling's the I think originator of this notion of why myth is important and what it reveals about, in Jungian terms, the archetypal structure of the collective unconscious that bottoms out, beyond just the human psyche into the cosmos itself.
Yeah, like I read the cosmologically and ontologically, I think they're almost stereoisomers here, like reflecting one another. That ontologically, it's a mythos, but at the same time, cosmologically, they're like two sides of a coin. So I like the example that Sean McGrath talks about. It's like nature and the subject are like your left and right hand. They're in different spots, physical spaces. However, they're the same and they reflect one another. That's how I see it as well too. Especially with the concept of nature, early in Schelling's work all the way through. I'm one of those thinkers that I don't really adhere to this strict, he has identity philosophy and nature philosophy, then negative philosophy and positive philosophy. I see him as having one open system with subtle changes. Because for me, what I see happening is identity, opposition, and unity, always. The three concepts are being correlated or named something different, but they are still coming together. There's still some kind of understanding of the absolute. And really trying to ground and grasp what is this absolute. And I think he does a great job. For me, the presentation of his system in 1801, I would say that text, the Freedom Essay, the Weltelter, the Ages of the World, the Deities of Samothrace, and the Philosophy of Mythology are all linked. So I'm proving right now that, this is just that what is inherent here is to give life to that moment before consciousness emerged. So this unvordenklich, this unprethinkable, or what he called the unconditioned, which was not determined, it's undetermined in his other works. So what is it? And this is why I think mythology is so important, because mythology kind of grasps this. He makes this joke about Zeus and the thunderbolts and Kronos eating his children, as I keep saying, and God's footstool. But there's something here, like in the Freedom Essay, when he's talking about taming the dark fire, he's using Meister Eckhart, like Gott ist Gott, like the eyes that I see God sees me as well. So there's this same reflecting of nature and the human. And this is why I liked Whitehead so much, because he takes Schelling and it goes a little bit further, right? So there's more of I don't want to say a holism. There's more of a continuity of what's going on, because Schelling is still using quite abstract language to grasp the identity of what's going on in regards to the copula and this kind of triplicity of ontology and cosmology. Sorry, I'm talking way too much with my hands.
No, it's helpful.
It's like the wheel and the ages of the world.
Right. Yeah. Well, I mean, I agree with you not wanting to break Schelling up into these different, as if he changed his position. Some people say there's like 5 different phases or whatever. I think there's a continuity from the very earliest essays on the Timaeus to, his work on mythology.
I love that text.
Yeah.
I can't tell you how refreshing this is. I can't tell you how refreshing it is to speak with another academic and, you know,
Agree.
scholar that is just interested in all the same areas.
It really
Sorry,
is. It really is a joy for me as well. Yeah.
sorry, I interrupted you.
Well, I was, trying to reflect on what you've said and the differences between, I mean, you said Whitehead carries Schelling forward, or I mean, in one sense, it's just a matter of, when you read Schelling's texts on the philosophy of nature and he's engaging with the sciences of his day in the 1790s, it's like they have a whole language that is, those paradigms in the sciences don't really exist anymore. So Schelling was doing the best he could with the cutting edge science. And the question is, to what extent are the principles of the philosophy of nature that he was working with still relevant today? And to decide that question, we would need to study all the sciences of physics, like relativity and quantum theories, to really understand evolution in a way that Schelling was just beginning to, and to understand complexity theory, which helps give way more concreteness to what Kant was originally trying to describe in terms of self-organization. And Whitehead has access to all of these new paradigm sciences. And he has the Schellingian intuition about the non-difference between subject and object. It's not simple identity, but they're not bifurcated either. There's, some sort of dialectical interplay here. And so Whitehead's fully aware of that. He's friends with too many idealists not to get that. But he's also not an idealist. He's
Right.
He was teaching at Harvard later in his life with a Bergsonian idealist, Carr, I think, Carr. And they got into some argument in front of the students, and it's recorded, this exchange by one of their students as, Whitehead getting kind of aggravated and with what Carr was saying, and saying, no, anyone who's been tackled in rugby knows what the real is, because you've been knocked over by it. And it kind of sounds like that critique. Was it Johnson critiquing Bishop Berkeley or something? And he's kicked a rock and said, "I refute your theory." Thus, Whitehead's a fan of Berkeley, and yet he uses a critique that maybe isn't, but it gets at Whitehead's sense of causal efficacy. Anyways, maybe we'll get into that later. But Whitehead takes this Schellingian intuition and shows how it can actually help us solve a lot of the problems of 20th century physics, like the fact that the two most successful theories in history are completely incompatible in terms of the picture of nature that they describe, if we're still working within a mechanistic metaphysics. And so Whitehead says, well, we just need a new metaphysics that's event-based, which, again, Schelling was prefiguring this in his notion of actants, I think.
Yep.
Whitehead develops an ontology of actual occasions, and at a metaphysical level, he has unified relativity and quantum theory. Nobody talks about that, but I think Whitehead has actually, again, at a metaphysical level, unified these. It needs to be worked out mathematically, and a lot of people are working on different approaches to quantum gravity, but Whitehead was describing metaphysically what they're trying to prove mathematically and physically now. And so, yeah, I think the story that's just beginning to be told now is that contemporary science is being saved from its mechanistic wrong turn by a revitalization of Schellingian nature philosophy. That's how I want to read it, at least.
I think that's very, I think that's great. I think it's also very hopeful. I hear Graham Harman say all the time, because he debates many physicists about his OOO. And he always says that when he speaks with physicists, they always say, you know what, we need you philosophers. We need you to create these concepts to push everything forward so we can get out there and start, math or thinking of it mathematically and trying to revitalize physics. I kind of like that. I like that idea.
And it's not just a metaphor, this vitalization of physics, right?
Yes. It's not. No, no, no. Um, as Schelling says, give it life.
Yeah.
To give it life. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So we were just talking about Hegel for a second, and then we jumped all over the place. Lines of flight are flying everywhere.
Yeah.
Oh, there's my subconscious Deleuzian coming out of me.
Yeah. I'm a
Yeah.
recovering Deleuzian too, though. I was hooked enough to read Difference and Repetition twice and start to kind of get it, and read some of his other books like The Fold, where Whitehead's discussed at length. Um, and I made the mistake of pretending to understand Deleuze at a conference once, and got kind of yelled at by a Deleuze scholar. And so I kind of backed away and went back into my safe place with Whitehead and Schelling. But
I totally left Deleuze studies because I was frustrated with the body of not all of them. I mean, Daniel W. Smith is great. Ian Buchanan is a very good friend of mine. Some of them are fantastic, but a lot of the Deleuze scholars that I was dialoguing with didn't know the history of philosophy. So they didn't know who Duns Scotus is. They didn't know what the University of Being was. They didn't know about Gilbert Simondon. They didn't know what individuation was. And it was really frustrating for me. And I found I left Deleuze because, or Deleuze studies, or reading him, is because I think he has this kind of arbitrary philosophy of creativity. Like, don't create because creativity is the unified absolute. Create because you have to. Create arbitrarily. And for me, it just felt, I'm sorry, there's a dog next door barking like crazy.
it's okay.
And for me, it just felt like a non kind of living philosophical system. It felt very artificial. And I kind of got out of it because of that element.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if people have made this connection before or what actual historical ties there might be, but it's almost surrealist in the sense that it just wants to, there's an element, and this is what I got in trouble for saying about Deleuze at this conference, actually, that there's an element of the, there's something like Deleuze, especially when he writes with Guattari, but also on his own, like this attempt to be outrageous, just to disturb settled habits of thought for the sake of it, which has a place, but it's also, it could be critiqued as apolitical in the sense that there's no concrete sense in which people who haven't read as much as Deleuze and get all of the illusions, that it's actually alienating the public, the general public, even more from philosophy.
And Peter Hallward, Zizek, Badiou, many thinkers, Bruno Bostiels, have brought up these critiques. Exactly what you're saying, apolitical. Sorry,
yeah,
cut you off again.
I'm just cribbing my notes from those thinkers here. So yeah. So, but anyways, Hegel, and then we went off on another line of flight into the witch himself.
The witch himself. Yes. I mean, I have most of all of my friends are Hegelians, believe it or not, and right now we're reading Hegel's Science of Logic over Zoom, a whole bunch of us. If you'd like to join, just let me know and I'll send you the Zoom invite. Come,
how often?
Please. Well, we were meeting once every 2 weeks.
Okay, that's very interesting to me. I might take you up on that.
No, please do. We're starting up again in September, and I'm through our Schelling group on Facebook. I'm going to run a reading of the Freedom Essay in 4 weeks. So we'll do 4 readings.
Nice.
You're also welcome to that as well too.
Great. I'm teaching my course on German Idealism again in the spring, so I need to, revisit a lot of this material. So that's great timing.
Oh, awesome! That's great. I'm still in the only teaching first years, so I get stuck with Hume and Descartes, which are still great thinkers.
Oh my God, those are great. I'd love to teach Hume and Descartes. People have the wrong idea about both of them, so sometimes it's.
I had this dream of writing a paper on Whitehead's process philosophy and joining it with Malebranche's occasionalism, just
Oh,
with the kind of removal of God there, just like,
yeah, yeah.
reformulated a bit.
That's a
But yeah,
beautiful idea. You should do that.
yeah, I love Malebranche. This is what really Malebranche for me is. He's pivotal in the line between Schelling and Whitehead, along with Meister Eckhart and Angelus Silesius and so many others. Jakob Burma as well too. But
Mm.
yeah, back to Hegel. My mind's flying all over the place.
Mm-hmm.
Um, yeah, for me it seemed rather limiting, rather too neat and tidy, and everything was solved perfectly in the chapter on spirit, in regards to ethics and politics. Um, but I was interested still more. My mentor in my undergraduate, his name is Jim Vernon, and he's a Hegelian, so he was still trying to impart Hegel on me, and so we were reading more and more, but I was losing interest slowly. Not to knock Hegel, he's a brilliant thinker, and everyone should read him. And yes, go home right now and read the Phenomenology. But I did it. You know, Heidegger says something really profound. He says, Hegel will Hegel will give you breath, but all negations lead to emptiness. He
Mm.
says this like kind of profound thing um, in one of his lectures on Hegel.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of where philosophy goes or can go after Hegel, I think um, it seems like, you know, Schelling showed us a chink in the armor, and how you can break through, you can learn deeply from Hegel, but then keep going um, into new and interesting directions. Like philosophy is not finished. And, you know, then you've got thinkers like Kierkegaard, who was at Schelling's last lectures. Um, I think a lot of Kierkegaard's great critique of Hegel is kind of obviously influenced by Schelling's critique.
Of course, yeah.
And then Nietzsche, of course, and then Heidegger. And there's a way in which post-Hegelian philosophy moves in a, you know, this phenomenological direction, let's say.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a line of thought that I have tried to read deeply in and appreciate, but it's different from the Whiteheadian line of thought, which comes out of, for Whitehead, it comes out of the sciences and mathematics, and he sort of read the philosophy to get up to speed so that he could then figure out how to fix metaphysics. So, you know, Whitehead's like, no, I'm going to do metaphysics, and at the same time that Heidegger's like, metaphysics is done, and we need to stop with this ontotheology crap. And I think Whitehead's not doing what Heidegger's critiquing, though. He's doing something different that comes out of, maybe it's American phenomenology or pragmatism coming out of William James, radical empiricism. And, you know, there's a little bit of cross-fertilization between Husserl and James, but his phenomenology is different because it's realist. And I think the Husserlian line, and even in Heidegger, there's still some idealistic residues there, in the sense that nature is not, there's not a world until human being presences it, you know,
Mm-hmm.
in Heidegger. And I think for James, he's way more of an evolutionary thinker, way more Schellingian in that sense. And obviously Whitehead's carrying forward that post-Hegelian stream. And so it's like, do you see a similar, I don't know if it's an opposition, but it's certainly a different way of doing philosophy after Hegel that you get in Heidegger versus Whitehead? And I prefer the Whiteheadian track, but I don't know if you accept the distinctions I'm making here.
I think, I do. I do, absolutely. You definitely have a lot more background in the sciences than I do. Way more. But just to shout back to Schelling for a second, he says something profound in both the Ages of the World and the Freedom Essay. He says that idealism and realism need one another, that idealism is like the spirit and realism is like the body, and that the two of them, you can't go anywhere without them. And so I agree with you that the move for philosophy right now is a kind of ontological realism. And I told you before, like I consider myself what I call a dynamic realist.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe we can dialogue later on about what that is in another video if you want to.
Sure.
But yes, so I definitely agree with you that there are limitations to phenomenology. Not limitations, you didn't really say that. Sorry, I'm putting words in your mouth. The phenomenological route is fantastic, but we need to start from a philosophical realism, an ontological realism is what I think.
Yeah, and I just, as you were talking about the ideal real tension that Schelling's pointing to, I grabbed Process and Reality, and because I thought of what Whitehead says, that he's mentioning Bradley, an idealist, and he says if this cosmology, as what he's articulating in Process and Reality, is to be deemed successful, it becomes natural at this point to ask whether the type of thought involved be not a transformation of some main doctrines of absolute idealism onto a realistic basis. So, in the way that, Schelling, like in the system of transcendental idealism, is trying to coordinate the transcendental and the natural philosophical perspectives, they need to be coordinated and coincide in a point of indifference, right?
Right.
That's basically what Whitehead seems to be saying there. It's like I start with on an empirical realistic basis and arrive at the same thing almost, or for all intents and purposes, as the absolute idealists, just from the opposite end.
Yeah, I have to admit it was this Schelling Whitehead connection. I was turned on to it through your YouTube videos, actually, and some of the stuff that I read that you had released. I had never thought of putting the two together because it's not that I don't think that Schelling is a process philosopher. I don't want to label Schelling as this or that.
Yeah.
But it's very evident in the 1799 treatise on the first outline when he's talking about production like a river, flowing and then hitting off rocks and then producing products, and this process of, he doesn't like the word immanence here. He likes the word becoming, is a lot like Whitehead. It's very much so. And even there's some things even in his later work, like the Ages of the World,
right,
when he's talking about the beginning of the cosmos.
Yeah.
But I keep cutting you off. Sorry.
Oh, no, not at all. I just, I have that quote actually from Schelling's Philosophy of Nature. I think 1799. Should I read it? The one about the stream? It's so beautiful.
Sure. Do it. Yeah, of course.
It's in my dissertation actually, and I say about it that a better extended metaphor for Whitehead's process ontology could hardly be imagined. So I'll read it. A stream flows in a straight line forward as long as it encounters no resistance. Where there is resistance, a whirlpool forms. Every original product of nature is such a whirlpool, every organism. The whirlpool is not something immobilized, it is rather something constantly transforming, reproduced anew at each moment. Thus no product in nature is fixed, but it is reproduced at each instant through the force of nature entire. We do not really see the subsistence of nature's products, just their continual being reproduced. Nature as a whole cooperates in every product. Certain points of inhibition in nature are originally set up. Consequently, perhaps there's only one point of inhibition from which the whole of nature develops itself. First of all, however, we can think infinitely many points of inhibition. At each such point, the stream of nature's activity will be broken, as it were, its productivity annihilated. But at each moment comes a new impulse, as it were, a new wave, which fills this sphere afresh. So, I mean, I could just go through every sentence and give you the correlate in Whitehead's philosophy. But that's it. That's why I do call Schelling a process philosopher.
Hmm.
But it's kind of playful. I know it's an anachronism, but I'm making a statement intentionally to be provocative, to point out this philosophy of nature that Schelling was articulating is what Whitehead has put into conversation with and used to interpret 20th century physics and biology.
Yeah, I think this is an interesting idea. I think this is also well articulated by yourself, to see the connections, continuity between the two thinkers. It's not that I'm not willing to call Schelling a process philosopher. Just there's so many labels on Schelling. I mean, like, you know, as Marx called him, what did Marx call him? A traveling salesman or something like that. It's just like I get leery when someone says, "Oh, he's an idealist." I don't see him as an idealist. Even in the system of transcendental idealism,
Yeah, certainly you
I
can't
think,
just simply refer to him as an idealist, but was it Hegel that called him the Proteus of philosophy, I think, in his...
yes, the Proteus, yes, yes. Um, is this where you would call is? I know you've brought this concept up before. Maybe I can get some clarification on it. You use the word, use the concept descendental. I've heard you use that before. This
Yeah,
is in your dissertation, right?
yeah.
Um, how do you use this concept in regards to how would you use this concept to clarify maybe some of the connections you're talking about right now?
So this is where the split happens, I think, that leads to the phenomenological tradition into the 20th century, on the one hand, and the alternative Whiteheadian stream on the other, which is that in Kant, you have this account of the transcendental conditions of experience and knowledge, and you end up with at least an epistemological dualism in Kant. It's no longer the ontological dualism that it was in Descartes, but an epistemological dualism where we can't know anything about reality or nature in itself. We can't even know ourselves, but as already prefigured by the forms of intuition of the form of intuition of time. And so in articulating what I call a descendental method of philosophy, it's an inversion of Kant. And instead of asking Kant's question, which is how does nature appear, what is the nature of the mind? What is the structure of the mind such that nature appears to us as it does? That's Kant's question, right?
Right.
I invert that and ask, in a way, what Schelling's question is. If we're playing Jeopardy, the answer would be nature is a priori, but the question is, what is nature such that mind could emerge from it as one of its products? Mind as in like the understanding with its categories, as Kant described it.
Mm-hmm.
So it's an inversion of the question, so naturally. It's a descendental method rather than a transcendental method. And so rather than trying to understand the conditions for the possibility of consciousness, as Kant does, descendental philosophy asks, what are the conditions of actuality? In other words,
Right.
in Whitehead's account of how societies of actual occasions become increasingly organized over the course of evolutionary time, such that something like a moment of conscious experience is possible. And now in this inverted descendental picture, it's no longer, you know, as Descartes thought, I think, therefore I am. You know, Whitehead inverts this and said, there are thoughts, and occasionally a thinker accompanies a thought as its superject, not as its pre-existing subject.
Right.
And so that's what the descendental method is. It's an inversion of the Kantian transcendental method, and it allows us to retrieve a sense of continuity between the human and the nature that we pretend to know, and in fact do know, I think, but in a participatory way. it eliminates that bifurcation that if you go along the other stream of thought into phenomenology, I think is still there. But I forgot about Merleau-Ponty, because he ends up reading Schelling and Whitehead late in his life and
Right.
realizing the problem.
The lectures on nature. Yeah.
Exactly. So he realizes, we need a philosophy of nature. Phenomenology is not enough, and so eventually that other stream does figure it out through Merleau-Ponty.
And Merleau-Ponty ends with Whitehead in those lectures.
Exactly.
Yeah. So.
All's well that ends well.
So do you consider yourself more Whiteheadian or Schellingian? There you go. I'm asking for these labels again after I said we shouldn't label anybody.
I don't know. It's like my 23andMe, ethnic breakdown. Like, do I identify more with the Franco-German side or the British side? It's like they're both. I'm trying to read them as figures that belong to the same lineage philosophically, and I consider myself to be a member of that lineage, and so
Right.
they're just my they're both my parents, my philosophical parents, and I'm not going to pick favorites.
No, that's good. That's good.
Yeah.
I like that. I like not to bring up him again, but Deleuze says something kind of profound. He says that all philosophers should have a canon, and their canon should be an apprenticeship.
I love that.
To them. And I do, for me, it's Parmenides and Plotinus and Erogena and Eckhart and Burma and Schelling and Heidegger and Whitehead and Marcus Gabriel and some other people as well, some newer thinkers.
No, for sure. My family's polygamous. I mean, there's many more than just Whitehead and Schelling.
Polygamous. I like that.
You can't understand Whitehead and Schelling if you don't have all that background that you're talking about, Whitehead is someone described Whitehead to me as a neo-Platonist. 7 neos because of the different stages in the history of Western philosophy where Platonism is revisioned. That Whitehead is the 7th reiteration. So yeah, like reading Plotinus, reading Plato, is going to help you understand Schelling and Whitehead a lot deeper than you otherwise would be able to.
See, this is something where I think maybe it's only you and I doing this, because like Plato is a faux pas now. It's like other than Ian Hamilton Grant, who has this, he reads him as having a one world ontology, which I think is brilliant in his philosophies of nature, or his Schelling's philosophy, or it's like philosophies of nature after Schelling.
Yep.
But the funny thing about this is I read the freedom essay in the Ages of the World. Well, particularly the Ages of the World as a creative reconfiguration of the Timaeus. That's what I think he's doing in the Ages of the World. I think he starts off with talking about the I think he starts talking off I think he starts talking about the Korah and Plato's surging sea in the freedom essay. But then when he talks about like God's footstool and he starts talking about, I like thinking it this way: if you have a seed is eternal until it's put into the soil. So this seed is eternal without any stimulus. This is the will that wills nothing. And then the soil would, once it has this kind of yearning, the Sehnsucht, the drive, and once it reaches there, it becomes a will that wills something. But interestingly enough, the demiurge in the Timaeus isn't God, right? It would be kind of like, sort of like the absolute, and the same thing applies in the Ages of the World. So I see this Platonism in Schelling and in Whitehead as well. That's just, it's right there. And so for me, Plato is someone we cannot forget. He's always there, especially in the Ages of the World. creative reconfiguration of the time is, right down to the first book at least. The second book, when he starts talking about the Trinity and the triplicity.
It's how the Timaeus begins, right? 1, 2, 3. Where's the fourth?
Yes.
That's brilliant. You've really opened up new vistas of interpretation for me. I hope you're writing about that connection.
I'm writing about it right now, actually.
Awesome.
My whole dissertation is on all three drafts of the Weltalter, the Ages of the World.
Wow.
And for me, I'm not so fond of the Judith Norman 1813 text, because I think it's, Schelling's son had a lot of pull with his father. And I think it's telling that Schelling's son is saying, clear this up, straighten this up, get this ready for publication. And then the 1815 translation is just, well, the 1815 translation is kind of controversial, because we think that Schelling's son added some kind of Christian context to certain areas. But the 1811 is just brilliant, because it's teeming with mythology, it's teeming with cosmology. And for me, the ontos and the cosmos are together. Like, you can't read Schelling without having an ontology or a cosmology, or so that's how I read him. I keep bringing up Schelling. I'm sorry. You can tell that I'm enamored with him. So.
No, you don't need to apologize. I'm really looking forward to reading that dissertation. How far along are you in that?
I'm about 4 chapters in. There's going to be 8 chapters.
Okay.
My advisor is actually kind of ill right now, so it's on hold. And I'm just currently writing 2 book reviews of 2 new Schelling texts right now. So that's what I'm working on right now, currently.
Great.
Remember, I have to send you those texts. I forgot. I haven't done that yet.
Oh, no worries. I look forward to receiving them. Yeah, wonderful. So, where to go from here?
This is not meant to be about me to can't talk. This is not meant to me talk about myself. I'm sorry.
Oh, no, I invite you to talk about your research. I'm very interested in it. But I think maybe we should move towards wrapping up and tying a nice bow on this.
Oh, yes. I'm sorry. I don't want to take you away from anything.
Oh, no. I have to go grocery shopping. It's not urgent, but we've covered a lot of territory. And
I think we should end with us discussing your evolutionary panpsychism. Yes, because at the end of the day, what do you do with both Schelling and Whitehead? How do you take the theoretical and make it the practical, right? This is the philosophical problem between the rational tradition, the empiricist tradition, the positivism, philosophical positivism, and metaphysics and epistemology. How do we do this? And I think you have a very nice reading of this when I was watching your debate. So maybe we can talk about that for a bit, and then we can go.
Sure.
And we can wrap that up, and there you go.
Sure. Well, yeah, it's funny. I was immersed in this debate with David Long and his community. It's coming out of the integral theory communities. It's not just Ken Wilber, but he's a big figure there. And David Long is sort of reacting against what he perceives to be a residual idealism in the Ken Wilber communities that David Long thinks is akin to just glorified creationism or something. And so I was trying to engage with him about some maybe more sophisticated forms of idealism, and also offer that actually, if you really immerse yourself in the cutting edge sciences of our day, this notion of emergence doesn't do all the work that you want it to do in terms of explaining where consciousness comes from.
Right.
Especially if you've read Kant, just for starters, or even just Descartes, and really understood the importance of the epistemological foundation that would allow for something like a totally objective description or explanation of how consciousness emerges from the collision of material particles. Like what's the transcendental or epistemological ground that allows you to make that claim, especially if the claim you're making is that consciousness emerges from collisions among particles that obey these mathematical laws that are totally deterministic. So
does he think it's like the Klineman? It's like the atom swerve that causes everything?
Right. Which, I'll grant every metaphysician one free miracle. I think there are better and worse ways of giving an interpretation of the nature of being and the nature of consciousness than presupposing an objectified, ontology of nature, mechanistic nature, and then trying to explain consciousness later, because as Kant you can't understand the Kantian Copernican revolution, which is really what all of modern science rests on. If you understand even a little bit about that, to try to explain consciousness as an emergent product of something merely mechanical is just a category error. It's just a category error. So whenever I deal with that sort of greedy reductionism, I'm always a transcendental idealist. I'm like, please read Kant, please. You're not even aware of the epistemological presuppositions that allow you to make the knowledge claim that you are. But I'm not ultimately an idealist of the Kantian stripe or any other stripe. I'm wanting to be a realist about consciousness and say, no, in Whitehead's phrase, it has truck with the totality of things. Consciousness is part of the actual universe. Experience is part of the actual universe. And to understand it and explain it, we need to give an evolutionary account that roots it in the seed that you're talking about, and it flowers from there. And there's a continuous process. And yes, there's emergence along the way into these, in Schelling's terms, recapitulations of the totality of nature in a slightly different balance of the infinitely opposed forces, and so you move through this great chain of being, or a great chain of becoming, maybe is a better way of phrasing it, where there are stages of emergence, but consciousness itself or experience itself isn't the kind of thing that can emerge out of matter imagined in this particulate mechanistic way. And so I'm trying to translate Whitehead and Schelling's really dense technical philosophical language into something that can be understood by people with an interest in like the Big Bang Theory and understanding like where human beings came from. So I want to be able to communicate to the general public and people that just have a college education, but maybe not in philosophy or in the sciences. And so when I talk about evolutionary panpsychism, it's like this, it's my attempt to popularize a Schellingian and a Whiteheadian view of why there is something rather than nothing, and where human beings came from. Because I think, as was the whole motivation for the Timaeus, as the characters in the dialogue articulated, is to explain where did Athens come from? Well, we need to know where human beings came from. Well, we need to know,
right,
the whole cosmological process that gave rise to human beings. And so the way that we imagine the cosmos and how it came to be has everything to do with how we imagine the human and how we imagine our political arrangements and social organizations. And so we really do need to, given how polarized politics is in terms of the partisanship and the abstractions through which we view one another in an increasingly fragmented society, we're not going to make any progress arguing with one another wearing these blue masks and red masks and screaming these ideological tropes. Like, I think we need to back up and I think engage in a conversation about the universe. And universe, to begin with, I would just want to point people to like the earth and the sky, do a kind of Heideggerian thing, like we are the human is the meeting place of earth and sky, and we're mortal and we have the idea of gods. And so like, that's where we kind of begin, right?
Right.
Let's start imagining how we'd like to live here. and what this even is, before we argue about politics, because, you know, we'll get there, but maybe we can come to some agreements about more primordial matters that are being taken for granted and maybe mistakes are being made in certain places when we imagine what the universe is, that if we resolve at the level of cosmology, then won't reemerge as a political disagreement later on. Does that make sense?
That does make sense. And I see I see when you were talking about creativity, because I mean, I as well would have a concept of God, but not, the man on the cross or, Yahweh or anyone. But this idea of, when people think about this concept of creativity, they don't realize that creativity is like contracting an illness. Like, I mean, I'm using this in the most broadest sense, but contracting something, and from that contraction, new becomings are made, new intensities are formed, and expand. So it's not just creativity. We're not trying to sound like Hallmark cards.
No, it's a birth process and it's painful.
Right. It is, of course. And that's so funny. It is a birth process. It is. And even in Schelling uses the word Scheidung and Entscheidung. Scheidung means scission, but Entscheidung means decision. And what is a decision? But a decision between two things or more. So this is the thing. This is what I was thinking of when I heard you talking about this idea of creativity. Yeah. And I was like, I got to talk to him about this. This is great.
Yeah. I mean, it's the creativity is the one way of thinking about the unprethinkable for me is as creativity. And
yes,
these birth metaphors are essential because it's like in the Timaeus again, it's the wet nurse of becoming. It's the place and time of birth and scission. Yeah, like it's, and anthropologically, like you're dropped into this mystery immediately. This ontological mystery is when you remember that people come out of other people. Like we're not just like parachuted in from another dimension. Like we emerge out of a hole in our mothers.
Wait. So you don't believe in the Urschleim? No, it's just a joke.
So yeah, yes, well, there's
but
a
even
deep...
Sorry. No, I was going to say that like the first single organism had to split as well too, right? Sorry.
Right. Exactly. Sorry. Yeah. I mean, the birth process ramifies into these more complex versions of itself, and the original scission was the energy event. I don't know what else, many ways we could describe it. Yeah. The primordial flaring forth that gave rise to what we call material and spatiotemporal reality. And every new form that emerges in the course of this cosmogenetic process is a recapitulation of that original birth at a higher potency. Right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And so it's, in a way, it's not done happening. I mean, if the seed's eternal and time is a moving image of it, then it's not done happening. Like we're still, and this is how physicists talk about it. One of my colleagues, Brian Swem, he's a cosmologist by training, worked on alternative theories of gravity, and became an evolutionary cosmologist and a philosopher and a storyteller ultimately later in his career. But he talks about how the Big Bang it's still happening. It didn't occur and then ended, and then like we're just the spit when after someone sneezes. It's like, no, like this sneeze is happening at every point in space simultaneously still. So that recognition that modern physical cosmology has brought us to is, another way of saying, when it's uttered poetically, I think it's akin to what Schelling was trying to do in Ages of the World, is narrate how the seed that seems to be in the past is actually still present.
Right. Yeah.
And Schelling didn't finish this particular work for a reason, because it might be an impossible task to finally narrate this situation, but he certainly left us with some potent indications.
I think he ends the Ages of the World with Clara, because what is Clara but the material as the scientist, the spirit of the priest or the pastor, and then Clara as personality. The ideal becoming the real, and then them still being connected, all three of these, I guess, potencies here through the dialogue. I like to read it in that sense, but I don't want to take you away from anything. So if you want to end here, or you have anything else to say, or.
Well, I just really am so enlivened by our conversation, and new connections have been forged, and I thank you for that. And
absolutely, I thank you too.
I certainly look forward to reading some of the things you're working on right now, and I'd love to have another conversation sometime soon.
Yes. So just before we go, I think we'll have you on the microdose, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
We can talk about Schelling, or we can talk about just process metaphysics, because we had one roughly that was, for the novice kind of learner. I gave you a shout out, by the way, on that.
I heard that. I listened to that episode.
Oh,
yeah.
Hopefully it wasn't a terrible episode.
No, I enjoyed it.
Yeah, so we were going to do a part 2 to it, so it'd be great if you would come on.
Yeah.
And talk about these same issues again, and maybe give more flesh to your position for your viewers, and I don't know.
That sounds like a lot of fun. So we'll find a date sometime soon for that, I hope.
Sure. Yes.
Cool.
All right. Thanks a lot, and I'll be in touch.
Thanks so much, Christopher.
No problem.